Mainstreaming the Transition to a Net Zero Economy. We will begin the webinar with opening remarks from the leaders of the Group of 30 Working Group on Climate Change and Finance. We'll hear first from the co-chairs, Dr. Mark Carney and Dr. Janet Yellen, followed by steering committee members Dr. Helene Ray, Mrs. Gail Kelly, and Dr. Philip Hildebrand. Please note that everyone will be speaking today on behalf of the Group of 30 Steering Committee and Working Group on Climate Change and Finance. They are here to discuss the results of the G30 study and to answer questions about the report. They are participating in this briefing webcast in their personal capacities, and their participation does not imply the support of their respective public and private institutions. We will begin a roundtable Q&A discussion immediately following the formal remarks. I'd now like to introduce Mark Carney, co-chair of the G30 Working Group on Climate Change and Finance. Dr. Carney?
Great. Thank you very much, Melissa. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And on behalf of my co-chair, Janet Yellen, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to look at this, what we think is a very important report. I'd also like to, on behalf of Janet, thank the core team, the project director, Casper Siegert, Debarshi Basu, Carol Crozat of BlackRock, Sini Matikainen and Jen Bell of the COP26 unit, and Stuart McIntosh of the G30 and the whole G30 team for making this happen on time and at an important time. Because it is an important time, the task is large, the window of opportunity is short, and the risks are existential. And to address climate change, everyone has to act now. That means governments, the private sector, and the financial sector. And this G30 report is about how these actions can create a virtuous cycle that mainstreams the transition to a net zero economy and brings benefits to all. Now, what I'd like to do is just briefly cover 4 of the building blocks before handing over to my colleagues. And the first is that public policy really has to provide the foundation for net zero and shape the incentives for the transition. Governments need comprehensive strategies for putting their economies on a trajectory to reach net zero by 2050. The specific steps in different countries will differ, but effective policy frameworks will satisfy some common principles. And they include carbon prices that increase in a gradual and predictable way, sharing the benefits of the transition to net zero equitably by using some of the proceeds of carbon pricing to support low-income households. And Dr. Yellen will discuss these design details on a carbon tax in a moment. Countries will also need to provide public funding for low-carbon infrastructure, loans, grants, and green R&D, in addition to targeted environmental regulations that can frame the transition. The second thing is that these policy measures must be credible and predictable. And this is where the report draws on some of the lessons from central banking. For policy to be predictable, the goals of climate policy need to be communicated effectively, providing a form of forward guidance on the path of future policy. Policy strategies need to command broad political support to be credible. Countries can cement their credibility by building a climate track record. To do that, they need to formulate intermediary goals and demonstrate the steps they're taking to achieve these steps. They can also build credibility more quickly by delegating selected decisions to independent carbon councils. And again, the success of central bank independence shows how such delegation can powerfully boost credibility. And Dr. Helene Ray will speak shortly about the merits of such an approach. But overall, the point is that by providing predictability and credibility provides greater certainty to the private sector and can accelerate the transition. Now, what do companies need to do? And this is the third building block, and that's to develop and disclose net zero transition plans. Reaching net zero will require a whole economy transition. That means every company in every sector, every insurer, every investor, every bank will need to adjust their business models. Company transition plans should set out targets for scope 1, 2, and scope 3 emissions and set credible interim milestones. Boards have a central role in overseeing these plans, management in implementing these plans, compensation and other arrangements need to be adjusted accordingly. Gail Kelly will bring her wealth of experience in managing global financial institutions to speak to the importance of governance in a moment. And the fourth and final building block is to assess the readiness of climate transition and expose both the risks and the major opportunities. Climate disclosure needs to go mainstream. Markets require information to operate effectively. What gets measured gets managed. We need companies to disclose their climate-related financial exposures. These need to be of high quality, and they need to be comparable across various jurisdictions. And this will only happen if climate-related disclosure goes not just mainstream, but ultimately becomes mandatory. And one of the recommendations of the report is that TCFD-style disclosure becomes mandatory by 2023. Now, there are a number of paths towards mandatory underway. Supervisors, such as the Bank of England, are looking for it. Other securities regulators have comply and explain approaches. Countries such as New Zealand are mandating it, and international standard setters are now acting, including the IFRS, which is consulting on climate-related disclosure framework as part of a broader sustainability effort. So let me conclude before handing over to Janet. A market in the transition to net zero is being built. And that's where the financial sector can manage the risks and seize the opportunities in that transition. And Dr. Philip Hildebrand will speak to that in more detail, giving an investor perspective. This market, though, this market in transition will reveal how the valuations of companies can change over time, how as climate policies adapt and carbon intensity declines. Importantly, this sort of virtuous circle can help smooth price adjustments rather than concentrating them in a sort of climate Minsky moment. It will also reveal enormous valuation opportunities, value creation opportunities, by allowing feedback between the market and policymaking, making climate policy a bit more like monetary policy, with policymakers learning from the market's reactions and the markets internalizing the policymakers' objective strategies and instruments, creating a virtuous cycle where companies disclose more information, investors make better informed decisions, and sustainable investment goes mainstream. With that, I would now like to hand over to Janet Yellen for her remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Let me also welcome all of our viewers today and say how pleased I am to join you for the launch of mainstreaming the transition to a net zero economy. The G30 initiated this study because of the overwhelming evidence that climate change is posing unprecedented risks to our livelihoods. We believe securing our net zero future is the challenge of our time, and time is running out. We can see that in the raging fires in California, in the increasing severity of hurricanes and typhoons, in the inundation of more than 25% of Bangladesh's land mass, and in the gradual but relentless submersion of Pacific islands beneath the rising sea caused by climate change. We believe COP26 and the world's governments must take much more ambitious strides. If we continue on the current path, global temperatures will rise by more than 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels this century, leading to severe and irreversible damage. I'd like to use my time to cover the main points in our report that pertain to the role of public policy in response to the climate change crisis. First, as Mark emphasized, public policy must provide the foundation for a transition to net zero. Our planet's climate is a public good. Private companies and financial institutions will not fully take the impact of their actions on our climate into account unless public policy forces them to do so. Policymakers must therefore lead our societies and economies toward net zero. Our governments in COP26 must set the broad policy goals, the timeline, and lay out the route to a more sustainable, resilient future for our grandchildren and future generations. We urge COP26 governments to establish comprehensive strategies for putting their economies on a trajectory to reaching net zero by 2050. The specific steps that countries take will differ, but an effective policy framework is essential. By setting out clear medium-term and long-term strategies, policymakers will galvanize private markets, spur the shift in investors' behavior, change millions of individual and societal choices, and speed the transition to net zero. The report makes clear we must dramatically shift economic incentives. Meaningful carbon prices are the cornerstone of any effective policy package. These prices should increase in a gradual and predictable way over time to support an orderly adjustment to net zero. By charging an explicit price for the right to emit greenhouse gases, policymakers can ensure that green businesses are not put at an unfair disadvantage relative to their polluting competitors. Gradually rising carbon prices will induce existing high carbon businesses to adjust to net zero in whatever way is most efficient, and will generate powerful incentives for households and businesses to switch to lower carbon energy sources and to reduce energy use. They will encourage technological innovation and spur the long-term, large-scale investments needed to reach net zero. Carbon prices also lend to inclusion in the financial models that businesses and investors use to evaluate investment decisions and assess opportunities. As Mark mentioned, in setting carbon prices, issues of equity must be addressed, and we urge that that be done by using some of the proceeds to support low-income households. But let me be clear, we believe carbon must be priced properly going forward in all sectors of the economy and across all economies. Complementary measures, as Mark noted, are also needed. Central banking offers some lessons we believe should apply to this net zero transition. The history of central banking shows that public policy must be predictable and credible to be maximally effective. With a predictable climate policy path, companies will start adjusting to the reality of a net zero world today, ensuring that this adjustment is efficient, orderly, and accelerated. But governments need not only to be predictable, they also need to be credible. And too often in the past, governments' climate strategies have lacked credibility because policymakers failed to deliver, and they undermine their own stated goals. COP26 states must build credibility through their consistent actions. Doing so will catalyze finance to react and markets to react. Investors will pull forward policies and ensure that the economy starts adjusting to them today. Let me close by saying again, we have precious little time to act. We know what we need to do. We urge COP26 and global leaders to set ambitious goals and strategies and begin the shift we must all make to a net zero, ecologically and economically sustainable future. Thank you. Let me now hand over to Elaine Ray to add some remarks.
Thank you very much, Janet. I'm delighted to take part in the launch of this important report. So Dr. Carney and Dr. Yellen have highlighted already the importance of public policy to give the right incentives for private sector decisions when dealing with climate change. And it is important that governments make sure climate policy is credible and also predictable, as Janet just said, in order for companies to be able to plan ahead. To gain credibility, governments can build the climate policy track record by announcing intermediate goals and actually reaching them. But a quicker and more effective way of building credibility would be to delegate key decisions to independent authorities that we call in the report carbon councils. An important part of climate policies is to make sure the price of carbon is rising over time to reflect its environmental cost. Politicians, to honor their pledge towards net zero in 2050, have to commit to such a rising carbon price path, and they have to stick to it. The problem we have is that politicians, in part because of the electoral cycle, of course, tend to renege on such promises. They may promise a high carbon price today, but then be tempted to renege on that promise if activity slows down, for example. Anticipating this, companies will not invest in the necessary structural changes to reach a net zero world because of the uncertainty politicians may create in climate policies. This increases greatly the costs of climate change and the transition costs. But this is a problem which is really very akin to the problem faced by governments in the past when having to establish their inflation credentials. And they solved it by delegating to independent central bankers the key decisions about inflation. It worked. Similarly, independent carbon councils would have to deal with the technical aspects of forecasting greenhouse gas emissions, estimating the right level of carbon pricing, and maybe, possibly, setting it themselves in order to hit the target of net zero in 2050 set by elected authorities. Just like most central banks, carbon councils would be held accountable in front of elected bodies such as parliaments. Because of the independence of carbon councils, climate policy would be predictable and credible, which would make the cost of transition to a low carbon economy much cheaper than otherwise. We think this institutional innovation would be extremely useful to make the commitments of our governments concrete, to make them feasible, and to lower the cost of our journey to a decarbonized world. And I'm now going to leave the floor to Gail to talk more about governance.
It's my pleasure to join my G30 colleagues this evening. Let me start by saying that the elements that Mark and Janet and Elena have set out are critical enablers for companies. What business needs is clarity and predictability of government policy, because it's certainty that drives action. But on the role of companies, I have 5 points to make. The first point is that all firms, financial and non-financial, require a climate strategy and a transition plan to a net zero economy. Now, as leading institutions know, and there are many of you on this forum, to be effective, these plans need to be integrated and embedded in the company's overall strategy. They're not something that can stand alone or stand separate. And as with all elements involving culture, it starts with the company outlining not just what is being done, but why it's being done and why it matters. And this gets to the heart of a company's role in society, within the communities in which it operates. Once you're clear on purpose, then strategy can follow and alignment is required. And because leading institutions, what they seek to do is embed ESG into the why, and then they drive alignment, and everything needs to be aligned. Policies, processes, what gets measured, what gets rewarded, how the business model operates, all needs to be aligned, all needs to be communicated, all needs to keep being tested. And there are many examples of fabulous companies doing this right now, leading in this ESG world. And we show some of those in this report. But my second point relates to company boards. So while the CEO and the management team are responsible for the development and implementation of the climate change strategy and transition plan, the board's role is crucial. And in my experience, having a designated board committee to review and oversight performance for ESG issues is best practice. It does a number of things. It signals to the organization the importance of the agenda, and it ensures that there's adequate time for detailed and forward-looking risk and opportunity assessments. Board members can do deep dives, they can assess the metrics, they can make sure they're holding people accountable, they can drive changes as required. And of course, it also means that board members remain knowledgeable and remain current in the area, which is really crucial. My third point relates specifically to financial institutions because they're very much in the vanguard of this change process. Effectively, financial institutions, lending policies, their insurance policies, and asset prices serve to pull forward the adjustment to a net zero economy. And because of this, they have a unique role to assist their companies, their customers, and they do so in a number of ways. For example, they encourage forward-looking scenario analysis and stress testing, working with their customers to help them do that. They help their companies, their customers identify opportunities, look for innovation. Of course, they provide capital. They provide information and advice, best practice examples as companies realign their business models, and they work with them on their disclosure frameworks. And this brings me to my fourth point, which is on the subject of disclosure, and Mark's already referred to this, because high quality disclosure is a fundamental requirement to drive to the transition. The TCFD disclosure framework's well accepted and well disseminated. In fact, there's excellent momentum around the world on this framework. But what's needed now is more companies to sign up, greater levels of disclosure, and greater consistency. And as Mark indicated in this report, we recommend that governments set a clear timeline for making TCFD compliant disclosure mandatory by 2023. And a lot of progress is underway there, as Mark indicated, for example, New Zealand already setting that mandatory goal by that date. But my final point is simply this, and that's that companies that step up, that actively pursue their climate change plans, that adapt their business models, will find productive opportunities and they'll convert them. And they will be the beneficiaries as the transition to a net zero economy occurs. And we can see this happening with increasing momentum, excellent momentum around the world. It's growing. And I know that Philip will have a lot more to say about this in his remarks. And so I hand over to him. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you very much, Gail. I hope you can hear me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's been a real pleasure to be part of this, as Mark said, what we think is a very important and timely report. As both Mark and Janet have emphasized, credible public policies and ambitious transition plans will provide the groundwork and shape the incentives for the transition to a net zero economy. That really is the starting point. This public commitment is essential to preserve the world's environmental and ecological viability, as well as its economic sustainability. All countries should set out clear objectives on greenhouse gases emissions reduction that are consistent with the global goal of achieving net zero by 2050. In turn, the financial system needs to play a decisive role in accelerating and amplifying the effectiveness of public policies. By factoring a forward-looking assessment of future climate policies, finance is already starting to price and factor climate-related risks into today's decision, driving the energy transition forward. And by assessing the impact of policies in a systematic way, it can ensure that climate policies inform the allocation of capital across all sectors of the economy. For companies to remain competitive and continue to attract capital, they need to prepare for a net zero world. Already today, investors can generate significant risk-adjusted returns by assessing climate-related factors. But in order to mainstream sustainable finance, the financial system needs to identify the full spectrum of companies that can support the transition to net zero and to more systematically assess climate risks. Developing a set of common metrics that capture these 50 shades of gray will help embed climate-related considerations in every single investment decision. And from the company's viewpoint, climate transition plans need to be accompanied by disclosure of high-quality, decision-useful information. Such disclosures allow the financial system to systematically allocate capital towards more sustainable technologies and companies. Over the past 5 years, disclosure of climate-related risks and opportunities has significantly increased. This has been achieved through widespread dissemination of the framework by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. But of course, more remains to be done. We therefore, in the report, recommend that all asset managers and creditors should demand TCFD consistent disclosure from the companies they invest in and lend to. Authorities around the world also need to set out a timetable for making TCFD compliant disclosure mandatory by 2023. While additional metrics will of course be useful to deepen the markets for sustainable finance, this is not a reason for investors to drag their feet. The time for investors to consider climate-related opportunities is now. By moving early, investors can size the opportunities that the transition brings before they are fully priced in. This will accelerate and amplify the effectiveness of public policy, and most importantly, will help avert the catastrophic impacts of unmitigated climate change. Thank you, and with that, I'll hand back to Melissa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hildebrand, and everyone. I thought I would start the Q&A process now with some questions that we received in advance. We're also taking questions live over the webinar. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'll start with this question directed toward perhaps Dr. Carney and Mrs. Kelly. How confident are you that firms will be able to apply TCFD reporting standards by your target date? And how should governments enforce the reporting mandate?
Okay, well, why don't I start, Gail, and make a couple of comments. First is that we've had now 3 cycles of reporting of TCFD, up to about 1,500 companies who are starting to apply it. The latest TCFD implementation report is actually coming out this month, which goes through what's being applied, what's going well, what is less applied, and gives a sense. And I will say one of the things that comes out from that report is where there's less information is exactly what the G30 report is calling for, which is information about strategy, forward-looking strategic resilience, and transition plans. So that's part of the reason why we as a group have emphasized this, this key point. So the first component is we have some information sort of rigorously applied in terms of that, how it's being put in place. The second is that the private sector is also thinking about what is most decision useful, words that Philip Hildebrand used a moment ago. And so you have groups such as the IBC of the World Economic Forum, which have concentrated in on the key elements of TCFD in their judgment, both on the buy side and the issuing companies of what is most decision useful. Last point, and then I'll hand to Gail, is it's very important these processes, whether it's in the European Union, in specific jurisdictions, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, etc., and I would underscore the IFRS process, which governs accounting basically everywhere outside, reporting, I should say, everywhere outside of the United States effectively. This process they've just launched to consult on sustainability reporting, focusing in on climate, focusing in on TCFD, and those are the processes that have to be engaged in order to get it in the right spot. But Gail, you've got practical experience around all this.
Thanks, Mark. I'll just add a couple of remarks. Look, personally, I think it is a realistic timetable, bearing in mind 4/5 of the top 1,100 global companies are already disclosing in line with some of the TCFD recommendations as of September of this year. And if you think about it, 2023 is still 3 years away. In fact, we debated in our forum whether it should be earlier, but we set on 2023. That's 3 years away, so there's time to go. And I think probably what you'll find governments do in a sort of pragmatic way, and that's what New Zealand is doing, is they're starting with the systemically important financial institutions as well as listed entities, and then making sure it becomes mandatory over time to some of the smaller ones. So start where it really, really matters. And that leads the way, it pulls others along the way. As I said, financial institutions are working with their customers to help them with the disclosure frameworks, what needs to go in, to give advice, because financial institutions in some ways are quite used to this with the regulatory environment that we're all part of. So, and we'll continue to advance it, continue to improve it. So it's not going to be lock it down at 22 to 23 and that's it. We'll continue to evolve and improve it, but we need consistent, standard, high quality set of disclosure that we can then evolve.
Thank you very much. I now have a question for Dr. Yellen. What if we do not get a consensus on carbon pricing and enforcement at COP26? You discussed the need for a coalition of the willing to proceed with carbon pricing and the possible need for a border adjustment tariff. Can you describe how that might work?
Yes, sure. Well, in theory, border taxes would be based on the carbon content of an imported good, both the direct and indirect content. But carbon content is something really difficult to compute. So our report suggests limiting border adjustments to the most carbon intensive products that would reduce complexity. The border adjustment would simply be the emissions related to the good times the domestic carbon price. And a country would rebate fees paid on carbon intensive exports. And our thinking is that countries with carbon pricing would form essentially clubs or carbon customs unions within which there would be frictionless trade in covered goods. We do think that a system with border adjustment taxes where necessary would be WTO compliant, could be designed so that they are WTO compliant.
Thank you very much. Next, I have a question for Dr. Hildebrand and Mrs. Kelly. How fast are you seeing businesses internalizing net zero? Are investors demanding change? And are ESG green assets performing as well or better than brown assets?
Maybe I can have a go. Thank you very much for an important question. I think I would say there are three forces at play, or three dynamics at play here. Number one, and this was mentioned, I think, by all of us, more or less explicitly, government policy really matters. Public policy really matters. And of course, we now have seen two major regions of the global economy spelling out clear and ambitious targets on net zero. That's in many ways the fundamental driving force. So it's pretty critical that, as we've said in the report, that this continues, that all major economies adopt these targets, ideally aligned with each other, so that we would have clarity on the overall incentive coming from the public side. Secondly, it is also pretty clear that increasingly there is a sense that there are commercial opportunities in being at the forefront of this dynamic. You can see in many cases that at a minimum risk-adjusted performance on portfolios improves as you start to incorporate transition risk. And so I think this will be the other driving force, is already the other driving force that is pushing things ahead. And the forward-looking financial actors are beginning to price this in and are beginning to pay attention to this. And third, as always, I think in these dynamics, I think it was Rudy Dornbusch who said a long time ago that things that should change sometimes take a lot of time until they begin to change. But once they begin to change, there's an acceleration effect that we tend to underestimate. And I see this very much day by day in the financial sector, that a theme that not so long ago seemed in many ways quite obscure has now become very mainstream. And so I would certainly expect a sort of collective psychological J-curve effect, if you like, that people realize the data is there, the data is compelling, they realize that the regulatory side is moving, the public policy side is moving, and therefore they realize there's an advantage to be ahead of this rather than getting caught out and being late. So I think once you combine these three factors, that kind of gives you the sense of the overall direction. And I would be cautiously optimistic that this will accelerate going forward. But we do need, and I'll end on this, we do need the fundamental public policy incentive by having clear targets from all major economies.
Thanks. I think Philip has answered that really comprehensively and extremely well. I would completely agree with the growing momentum and the J-curve effect. Interestingly, here in my part of the world, a recent survey was conducted with the Australian and New Zealand investors, and that showed that investors are putting a much sharper focus in this area. They're increasingly setting or considering setting portfolio-wide goals for net zero emissions, but they call out policy uncertainty as a barrier, just as Philip has indicated. Another thing that was really good to see is that a high percentage have indicated that COVID-19 is not a factor slowing them at all. And we see in AGMs, for example, just in a very practical way, how investors are engaging companies, company directors, company boards, and seeking to drive change. And they want to see a link to remuneration outcomes as a critical element. On that question of green versus brown performance, again, my European colleagues might have more to say here, but green bonds, as I understand it, are pricing and trading tighter than conventional bonds. And there are numerous studies that show sustainable companies and responsible investment funds are outperforming the general market. So that's some indication of the path we're on.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn to some live questions in a moment, but before we do, I had a question that was submitted in advance for Dr. Ray. Can you describe how the French system, the Haute Council, reflects the Carbon Council concept you recommend? What does executive independence look like in practice?
Thank you. So the Haut Conseil for Climate in France was an independent organization which was created in 2019. And it's an organization that gives advice on public policies to reduce CO2 emissions. The president of that council is a climatologist, but that council publishes a report once a year on emissions and also once every 5 years on the national strategies to reach the net zero in 2050. These reports are public, but actually there is no real mechanism through which the government is held accountable by the Haut Conseil. So there is no explicit comply or explain mechanism, for example, nor any executive powers which are given to that Haut Conseil. So I think here we would have in mind carbon councils which would be able to influence maybe in a more tangible way government policies than that Haut Conseil.
Thank you very much. I have a live question from Heather Schofield at the Toronto Star. She's asking the panel, how does the pandemic and its parallel economic crisis change the calculus for governments and businesses to take the steps you have outlined? And is there any jurisdiction or sector of the economy doing this well and setting the standard?
Maybe I'll lead off, and colleagues will chime in. I think it's a very important question. I'll reference what Gail just said in terms of the focus, and what Philip just said in terms of the focus of the financial sector. And I think what we're looking to do is to underscore that momentum, that it is very much, this is mainstreaming in the financial sector. I think that's a message to policymakers and governments when considering their climate policy. So that's the first point. This is mainstreaming, it's not fringe. There is a focus on this. And there is therefore this opportunity with coherent, credible, and predictable climate policy to really accelerate the transition in everybody's interest. And as Janet said in her opening remarks, this is a very powerful approach. Now, in terms of, and I'll end with just a couple references. If you look at a series of budget and budget initiatives in Europe, they have been consistent with this principle. So whether it's the European Recovery Fund, the French budget, the German budget, the announcement this week, earlier this week by Prime Minister Johnson for the UK around wind, which is one of the components of a much bigger strategy, as he outlined. He outlined that it will be part of a bigger strategy. The point in all of these cases, you're seeing in the first three, more than a third of the spending is related to sustainable initiatives. Secondly, it's medium, longer term, and it's backed up by regulatory initiatives such as mandates for hydrogen fuels, changes to internal combustion engine use, other structures that point the way for the private sector. This is the nature of the energy transition in Europe. So there's money for the adjustment, but there's also framing of the adjustment through regulatory and other policies. And that creates the prospect of this virtuous cycle coming into play. Of course, we supplement that with the importance of carbon pricing and governments following through on these commitments to build that track record. But I think we are seeing it. But let me defer to colleagues to expand.
I would just chime in also that in the United States, given the highly adverse impact of the pandemic on jobs and on the economy, there's a good deal of thinking about the need for ongoing fiscal stimulus, for possibly a significant infrastructure program nationally, and in some states like California, where green initiatives are already a very high priority. And there's a widespread recognition in the United States of the need to so-called build back better and to address longstanding problems as we put in place fiscal stimulus and infrastructure projects. And I think there will be a focus on green initiatives, the kinds of infrastructure that the public sector needs to put in place to facilitate a transition to net zero.
I just quickly add to that with regard to Australia. I must say I was concerned early on when the COVID-19 crisis hit that we would be set back a little and that people would say, look, let me deal with the crisis right in front of me. But actually it's been the reverse. There's something about this crisis that's got parallels with the climate change agenda. And there's several lessons that we could actually draw out of being prepared, being ready ahead of time, and listening to the science, understanding the science and listening to the science. And here in Australia, as Janet has said, same in the United States, very significant fiscal stimulus programs. And I'm working with a couple of the entities here within Australia, and a lot of that's being directed to renewable energy. It's being directed to the right kinds of sustainable for the long run in order to build jobs and in order to build a better, more sustainable environment for the future. So there's an alignment with the economic goals as well as the climate change agenda. And Australia's just come out with a very important paper that's a sort of a roadmap of technologies for the future. So we've still got a bit of a way to go here to sort of nail down a concrete commitment to a target of net zero by 2050, but good progress.
I would also add to all of this that in the context of this broad context of investing, that is clearly going to be, by definition, a major theme in the years to come post-COVID. You can also see in the market itself some trends that give rise to hope. For instance, there's no question that the demand for sustainable products and offerings in our industry is accelerating very, very rapidly. And you can see this across, I would say, all product categories, essentially, whether it's fixed income, equities, multi-asset. Importantly, I think you're also seeing as a result of this enormous focus on innovation in our industry, on generating, offering new products to our clients. Traditionally, we saw a lot of this first in the index-oriented space. You're now seeing a whole kind of remaking of the active industry towards incorporating ESG factors, and importantly, in the context of some of the investment comments that were made around the public side, you can also see now an enormous effort in the private equity space to kind of reinvent private equity and orient it towards sustainable investment. So I think we're seeing the client demand, no question about it. We're seeing innovation, the response from the industry. And finally, I would also say this is a short window, but if you look at the period of COVID this past year, the performance record of sustainability enhanced investment offerings is actually very, very compelling. I'll give you one statistic from our platform. Something like 95 of our sustainable ETFs have outperformed their corresponding traditional ETFs. And that, of course, again, in turn fuels, if you like, the client demand. So the pieces are aligning very much in the context of this overall context of the need for public investments.
Thank you. I have a question from Inigo Bengochea at the CFA Institute. He says, renewable energy does not look ready for mass widespread adoption. Our reliance on fossil fuel is still pretty much a reality. Do we need to wait for additional technology improvements that will make renewable energy much more feasible to achieve a net zero economy?
Well, why don't I start? I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question. The levelized costs of wind and solar are lower than conventional energy sources. So from a flow basis, from an investment basis, certain renewables, hydro, obviously, I would also add to that bucket, are clearly cost competitive with conventional sources. And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing actual dollar invested in renewables comparable to dollar invested in fossil fuels sources at this time. So there has been a big shift. Now, I think, and so maybe something's lost in the chat in terms of the preciseness of the question, because it is the case that there are additional technological developments or scale developments in some cases that are necessary to complete the energy transition. So in terms of battery storage, which has come down quite dramatically, but for scale in grids, there needs to be a bit more progress there. Hydrogen, one of the key areas for some of the hard to abate sectors and heavy transportation, so large truck transportation, maritime transportation, there needs to be further progress there. And again, to go back to, I think it was Heather Schofield's question earlier, that was, that's part of the reason why a number of governments are putting money behind and regulatory mandates behind hydrogen, because that's exactly the type of approach that pulls forward the type of improvements in competitiveness that we have seen in wind and solar over the last decade. And one of the points, and maybe I'll finish on this, which is just to bring it back to spending post-crisis. Some of the countries who spent quite wisely post the global financial crisis in wind and solar, think South Korea, think Germany as well, and have developed as a consequence quite competitive industries as well. That lesson hasn't been lost on governments. And I guess the final point I'll make, which is not directly to this question, but I neglected to earlier, which is that there's fairly substantial evidence now that policymakers are taking into account that a lot of sustainable spending is more job heavy than conventional shovel-ready infrastructure. And I know that I think that influenced a number of governments in terms of their approach as well. So it has a medium-term benefit and a necessity, but actually the short-term payoff is quite substantial as well.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Dr. Ray from Governor Yi Gang of the People's Bank of China. He says, for international airplanes and ocean ships, whom do they pay carbon tax or carbon quota price? And who is going to allocate this money for carbon sink? We know people debate on the EU initiative whether the Carbon Council or a similar council can do this job.
Thank you very much. So this is an excellent question. So first of all, I mean, from the point of view of carbon councils, it would make sense indeed to think about it at the EU level rather than at a national level, because having a carbon price which is equalized to the biggest on the biggest possible area is what we would like to have. So in the EU, we have the ETS initiative, which is the emission trading scheme initiative, which essentially is about the issuance of permits for greenhouse gas emissions. And as these permits become scarcer, the price of carbon goes up. Now, this initiative covers only 45% so far of the EU greenhouse gas emissions. And it covers, for example, the airplanes, but only to the extent that the planes are within the EU. So indeed, it doesn't cover anything outside the EU, of course. And so as we are trying, or the ideal would be to have a carbon price which is the widest possible carbon price in terms of country coverage, we would have to think indeed of issues that Janet explained very well, the carbon adjustment tax at the border, in order to have a level playing field for all the imports and exports. And we would also have to think about international travel across countries. So I think this is something that definitely would have to be negotiated. And I don't think we have an answer so far to the question of how exactly we should divide this. But this is something that is high on the agenda, at the same time as how we would indeed construct carbon adjustment prices adjustment at the borders, which is a key issue if we want the price of carbon to have an effect which would avoid the leakages across the various countries. Evidently, if we have jurisdictions in which carbon is not priced, this would undermine a lot of the efficiency of the policies of a rising carbon price in the jurisdictions that it would be that would have it. So these are absolutely key issues, and I think hopefully the forthcoming COP26 in particular will be able to discuss this.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Matthew Green of Reuters. When does the panel think we will see the first company director being held personally liable for climate misconduct, for failing to ensure that climate risks are properly reflected in their company's financial statement?
I'll dive into that one first and jump on that grenade. Of course, the point of this is the positive about the approach that is consistent with pulling forward the transition and acting responsibly, given the adjustment that is necessary as opposed to a punitive one. I think what Gail has outlined is consistent with good governance, and the G30 has always been about supporting good governance and promoting it, and this is a contribution to that, both at the corporate level and obviously at the aggregate policy level. So I'd emphasize the positive and the momentum that is developing in that direction.
Maybe I can add something. I'm not sure exactly how the question was meant, but from a, from the market's perspective, from an asset management perspective, to what extent the market is going to force behavioral change, if you like. And as you know, we and many other asset managers have made big steps here. We, in January, have stated very clearly that we will bring an increased sense of urgency to our stewardship efforts. going forward. Now this is, and it's important to always remember this is based on a very simple conviction and a very simple principle, namely that climate risk is investment risk. So it's very much in line with the fiduciary responsibility that all asset managers would have. We would act because climate risk is investment risk. In our case, and I can only speak for our specific case, 2020 has been a year of transition in that respect. We have completely reset our stewardship team. We've put in new leadership, and we very much increased the transparency of our voting process. And in fact, have put, if you look at the record, we've put 191 companies on watch where we believe more substantial progress is necessary. So I would say, speaking generally, as a result of our commitment and these changes that we're implementing during this transition year, you should certainly expect that our voting and engagement outputs in 2021 around climate will look materially different from the past year.
The only thing I would add is that there's already an increasing extraordinary reputational impact on companies and on their directors and on their top management around ESG related matters. We've seen that in the health and safety, the well-being space for some period of time. And in certain jurisdictions, certainly in Australia, you're criminally held liable for failings in that respect as directors. But reputationally, we've seen it with companies that have, failed to take account of whether it's cultural practices within communities, environmental practices within communities, very big reputational impact that can actually lead to directors leaving, CEOs leaving, etc. So, and the momentum grows from there. But I think I would go for the positive. It's about education. It's about starting with being clear on what your company purpose is, and then seeking to align everything behind it.
Thank you very much. We just have a couple more minutes, and I have a question from Francois Tilly at Euroclear, who's asking, how do you see the importance of capital markets and local currency, especially for emerging markets, where the transition will probably be more expensive? So the transition to net zero.
Well, let me start on that. I'll say a couple of things. One is that, and just explain a bit on how the dynamic can work here. So the report emphasizes scope 3 emissions, transition plans that include scope 3 emissions. And of course, for larger multinational companies, once you have scope 3 emissions, you're going up and down the supply chain. You're bringing all of the global supply chain in, which includes emerging and developing countries. So that is one aspect of the cross-border aspect of the adjustment. And so it aligns the incentive of the company, let's say a large advanced economy listed company, aligns the incentive with those in the supply chain to reduce emissions, including in emerging and developing countries. So that's the first element. Second element is something that the report touches on. It's not central to it, but that we're working on that I should make clear, which is the COP26 process under Bill Winter's leadership. Bill is the, as many will know, the CEO of Standard Chartered, working with Annette Nazareth, an old colleague of Janet Yellen's when Annette was at the SEC and Janet was at the Fed. And they are working with a very large group of private sector participants that include the clearinghouses and the buy side, sell side providers, et cetera, across the world to develop a cross-border market for what's called nature-based solutions and carbon offsets. And many of the most efficient, cheapest, said another word, offsets will be in emerging and developing economies. And that's how you tie together a net zero strategy for a company with investment in those economies. That's one of the ways you tie it as well, because there's a huge incentive. And this, by the way, this is a market that's measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars today. It should be in the tens of billions of dollars per annum, ultimately headed towards 100 billion is our judgment. And so I would just encourage our friends from Euroclear and those others watching for the blueprint, the Winter's blueprint, which will come out in the first quarter of next year, with lining up with an intention to have a pilot for that, because that is one of the ways that you get this alignment and you make a much more efficient transition everywhere.
Thank you very much, everyone, for all of your questions and for taking the time to join us today in this important discussion. Dr. Carney, Dr. Yellen, do you have any final remarks?
Would like to thank the audience for joining us today in unveiling this report that we believe is very important and we hope will spur action.
Yeah, and I'll just echo Janet's thanks. Thank all my colleagues and extended colleagues on the working group, supported the G30, and really just underscore this point, this opportunity that exists. I mean, I know these are difficult times, but there is an enormous opportunity because this alignment between the focus of the financial sector, the needs of the economy to recover from COVID, the needs to address climate change, that we really can create this virtuous cycle that is going to accelerate the transition, create jobs and growth, and that we're very keen that all those, we all have a role in it. So let's seize this opportunity. Thank you very much.